Hey everyone, Eric Watson here, freelance writer, player of games, writer of words, recorder of videos, and tabletop role-playing aficionado. Welcome to another DM's Guild review, my written and video review series where I take a look at the adventures and supplemental material at the Dungeon Masters Guild website. This video, I'll be reviewing the DM's Guild mini-adventure, Scourge of the Nightingale Part 1, A Song of Love, designed by Jeff C. Stevens for Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. A review copy has been provided for the purposes of this review. If you enjoy my videos, consider using my affiliate links for your DM's Guild shopping and supporting me via patreon.com/roguewatson. Shoutouts to my platinum patrons Andrew, Richard, Joe, Will, Tiny Dancer, Nick, Andy, and Chris, and gold patrons RPG Papercrafts, Charming Grenade, Pretty Boy Numa, Marcos De Vicente, Gilberto, Sean, AK, Cert to be Adam, Dead Lizard Lounge, Sam, Rosh, and Lippy Spuds. Thank you all very much for your support. One of my favorite fantasy series is the I forgot. The name of the first book is The Lies of Loch Lamora by Scott Lynch. I think it's up to 3 books now, and the third book, I believe, is called The Republic of Thieves. And that one, it's not to go off on too much of a tangent here, but it is a series. It's very low magic, and it just happens to be this like basically crime organization team, kind of a good guy version of a bunch of rogues. Think about like an all rogue party. And they just get into a bunch of heists and schemes and all this. And the third one involves them having to pose as an acting troupe. And so that's a big part of their schemes in a different city, is they're all pretending to be actors and they get all embroiled in this drama. In A Song of Love, Part 1 of Scourge of the Nightingale, that is one of the little things that you can go on, despite it being a very, very short AL-style adventure, which is meant to be played in a matter of hours, the entire thing. And it is part 1 of a larger trilogy. It does tell a complete story, and it does at the very end have a really fun option for you to infiltrate this Goblin Fort, which is you can all take on the role of these performers. And it even includes a written play for you to perform, which is really delightful and fun. So I enjoyed that quite a bit, and that reminded me of that Republic of Thieves book in a really good way. So this is a mini adventure designed for levels 1 through 10, which is a little nuts. I always, cock an eyebrow whenever I see any adventure that can scale that heavily, especially from 1 to 10, is a little nuts. And that's probably my biggest complaint about it, is I don't think it should scale that much because it deals directly with goblins. And to me, goblins are the perennial low-level tier 1 monsters, and fighting just super powered versions of goblins, like what this one does, is like goblin berserkers and goblin sorcerers and all that at like level 8 or 9 is really silly. Like at that point, I mean, at the very least, throw some hobgoblins or some orcs or something bigger in there. It really is bizarre that the designer hung so tightly to the goblin thing. And what's even weirder is it's written, from what I can tell, designed for, APL 8 to 9. So it's written as a level 8 to 9 adventure, despite the story basically being a bunch of goblins kidnap a person and you have to go rescue them, which is such a low-level concept, especially because it's part 1 of a trilogy. And then the next ones are designed to be slightly higher level, and it even involves milestone leveling at the end where it says, hey, you can level up from like level 1 to 2, unless, of course, you're playing at a higher level. So it's a very odd case of like having your cake and eating it too, where they wanted to do this big level scaling and have it open for more people, but I don't think it actually works very well like that. I think it works very well as a low-level tier 1 adventure, specifically maybe between like 1 and 4. Now, I have not looked at or seen or reviewed the other parts, which are listed right here, part 2 and part 3. I really like the way this looks, by the way, and the cover art is amazing for part 2 and 3. The fact that you can tell, okay, this is actually a finished series, and you know what you're going to get out of it. And I believe you can buy the entire trilogy as one pack on the DM's Guild. This review is only reviewing part 1 because that's the only review that I got for it. So I don't like the level scaling as much. I do appreciate that it does adjust for it, but it's pretty silly when you realize that, like, to basically make APL 10, they're just super powerful goblins with like 100 hit points each. Like, it's fucking ridiculous. And then, of course, at APL 1, it's every goblin is just a regular goblin with like 3 hit points. So it's really silly. Like, I don't think goblins are supposed to scale this much, frankly. So I like the idea that it can scale. I would not have scaled it to this much. And I would have straight up started replacing goblins with other creatures, like with hobgoblins or something, without having to change things too much. But at some point, it gets really silly. Now, I feel bad that I started with my biggest complaint because the rest of it is really, really good. It's very well written. There's a few little grammatical errors here and there. And in fact, at one point, it switches between hobgoblin and orc to describe a character, which is a little confusing, but not enough to where I'm going to put that as a major complaint. I generally like the way it's structured. Like I said, it uses the Adventures League model, which is going over everything in the beginning, telling you kind of how long, estimated duration for each section, and it follows the usual. At the beginning, you get your quest, and then you go to a location and have an encounter, and then you go to another location and have probably a bunch of encounters, and then you beat a boss and you finish it, and then you get to the end. That's it can probably be played depending on how much combat there is. Obviously, if you end up fighting the entire Goblin Fort, you're probably not going to get it done in one sitting. But if your players are smart about it, you could probably do it within one session. So the overall story here, the Nightingale has her own backstory as this kind of interesting villain. The backstory is written basically like a player backstory, like somebody who had this big tragedy happen, and that kind of shaped her whole background. And then she went from being a bard to a monk, and it literally just sounds like it's a player that wrote this backstory. But she happens to be the villain, and kind of like a horror movie, she is now taking her revenge out on those who wronged her initially. You don't really need any of that information to actually run this adventure. It doesn't do a great job of using that villain except to tease, and it is a trilogy, so I get that we don't have to resolve all that for the future stuff. But in the beginning, it's basically this villainous Nightingale sent a bunch of goblins out to kidnap a man on his wedding day, which I guess is just bad luck that it was his wedding day. And that's the adventure hook. The party has been invited to this wedding, which is kind of a fun adventuring hook, although I don't know why the players would be invited, but sure. You'll have to hook that in somehow. They show up, and it's a big tragedy. Actually, it shows up in a kind of exciting way because the groom to be is on a giant goat fighting a goblin, which is a nice little inciting incident rather than just showing up and getting a quest from somebody. I do like it when you have your. I like my incidents inciting. I like when you have some kind of action that starts everything off. So that's a fun way of doing it. And the party can all get giant goats as they join with Gildus Strong to go rescue his would-be husband from this huge goblin tribe. And it's a really neat encounter, which do we not get? Okay, I guess that's the biggest map here. We do get separate maps. I was hoping this would be a bigger map I could show you. But it's a really neat encounter. It's this giant tree with multiple platforms hanging off at different elevations, and then the top connects to a nearby cliff. And of course, there's goblins on all these platforms, and there's a whole pulley system. It just seems really, really cool. And there's a bunch of goblins with bows drawn. I like this encounter a lot, and we get a map for it. It's designed for a combat encounter. The goblins will extort you, so the husband or the soon-to-be husband, fiance, I guess, has the money prepared, but the goblins, of course, the deal goes wrong. The goblins ask for more money, try to extort you, and then it turns into a big fight. And as you can see on the right-hand side, setting up the encounter, it's ridiculous how much it goes from APL 1 to APL 10. I think that's too much. I don't think adjustments should not be made that much with using the same kind of creatures. I appreciate that a bunch of new goblin stat blocks were given here. If you're into goblins, there's goblin archers, there's goblin enchanters, there's goblin berserkers, there's goblin knights. You can stir fry goblins, you can put them in tacos. There's all kinds of different options for goblin lovers. But at level 10, I don't want to be fucking fighting goblins. Sorry, I don't care if it's a superpowered goblin. And in fact, I think a superpowered goblin is bullshit anyway at that level. I don't want to fight a 99 hit point goblin. Nobody wants to fight a 99 hit point goblin. Come on now. So I just keep it tier 1. I would be lower level goblins, but I do love the setup, and I like the fact that we get this map. It's a cool looking map. One thing I would add to the designer and to all designers out there, if you have a map with key multiple elevations on it, for the DM map that has the annotations, please put the elevation differences directly on that map. That helps a lot. So for example, one platform can have little plus 30 feet. Another platform can have plus 50 feet written nearby. And as the DM, I might even put that on the player map to just show that way, because that can cause a lot of confusion, because unfortunately the way we all play tabletop games is it's all from a directly overhead drone, point of view, and it's very hard to tell elevation differences when you're looking straight down. So that helps a lot when you've got those kind of maps. I do love those kind of maps because that automatically creates a really interesting battlefield. Potentially very, very dangerous for extremely low level players, but that's a way to make a goblin encounter way more interesting, is give them all this terrain advantage and force you to try to dodge around and work on these platforms and use the pulleys and everything. So I think it's just a really cool encounter and very neat. And from there, once you defeat that encounter, the actual person, which I think is a hobgoblin, but as I said, at one point it changes into an orc. You can follow their tracks to the fort. There's a weird part here too, where depending on how much time you have, you can have this random ass commoner join you, who's this kind of jackass hero who just dressed up as a hero using at a costume shop, and then can kind of just is outside of this fort and can kind of give you some information. It felt a little too weird for me. I didn't need that many more NPC. Like we already have the quest giving NPC that can join the party. I don't need this other one necessarily with me, even though he seems like kind of a funny character. But it leads to this giant goblin fort, which is here. And this is where this dwarf comes trundling along with an entertainment troupe of like a bard company. And they're going to perform this play through this fort because the players need to get in the fort and rescue Devon, I think his name, Devon, to rescue the poor kidnapped fiancé. And one option they have is to join this bard entertainment troupe, be handed these performances, which is literally written. I'll have to skip down a couple. Here we go. The Rescue of the Goblin Maiden Fair. And it is written like a play. Like you've got all these different characters and they've got different scenes. It's very small and short. Again, it's developed like an Adventures League style module. So everything is kind of truncated in a way that I'm not terribly fond of. But I still really like the idea here. So much so that if you've got like theater kids as your players, and let's face it, a lot of D&D fans are that social circle and that group. You could probably just give them the characters and let them go nuts. You don't have to really give them this written down scene. It's kind of a funny thing, but it's about like it's kind of a Shakespearean play, but with goblins. So I think that's a really funny thing to do. The only thing I was a bit confused on is, of course, the designer definitely wants to recommend doing that route, which I, as the DM, would recommend that also. But what it does is it pulls all the goblins to the stage. So I think the idea here is you want to have maybe some of the players, probably the ones who would enjoy that more and maybe have better charisma checks. Or, and it does mention, hey, if your players are just role-playing the hell out of this, don't do charisma checks. Just let it happen. Split the party up. Have half the party do the play and distract the guards. And it does mention that after each scene, the better you do, the more of the fort actually congregates here. And then the idea here, I think, would be that the other half of the party, or one person, the rogue, whoever else, would be able to sneak around and check out the fort. I think that's the idea. I wasn't quite clear on otherwise what's the point, other than it's just a way to get in the fort. But then potentially this could be a very difficult, dangerous combat encounter if things go wrong and people get caught. So I feel like there should have been just a little bit more information on kind of the consequences. But again, as an AL style adventure, it's a little bit brief when it comes to the information. It does give different options, though, if you don't want to do the performance route, because that might be a little too railroady for some. You can, of course, break down the gate, just charge right in. You can climb over the fence. There's a secret entrance on the side. I think there's always a boss fight at the end because the actual kidnapped Devon is located in one of these eastern buildings, and then the boss goblin actually comes out, with some nice plot timing about whenever you're exiting with him, and then there's at least a little bit of a boss fight there, so you do have to fight them. You do get a cutscene with the villainous Nightingale, which is a cool cutscene because she shows off her power and kind of knocks this one, whoever was the kidnapper, out because they didn't get the money, basically, because goblins had botched it. This is why you don't hire goblins, people. You don't hire goblins to do your work. They're stupid. So she's pissed, and then that's all you see of her, and she rides off. And then you find a note in this fort that kind of details the next stage of the plan, which presumably is in the next part. So there's not a whole lot more. She's not the actual boss here. And you don't, unfortunately, learn anything. I wish there was a final scene at the end, because it mentions the fact that Gildas does know the Nightingale, but doesn't know her or knows her real name and knows her from like a childhood. And that's why she's got revenge, because she was there during this big scene where she was attacked and all this. So I feel like we kind of missed a step at the very end where he should have explained maybe a little bit more what's going on, just to make the players more interested about what the hell is going on in this area and why they should care about the Nightingale. But maybe this is just meant to be an introduction, a very slight introduction to that. Again, it feels like it's meant for low-level players, but it's written for level 8, and it can scale from 1 to 10, which I find kind of bizarre. But I do appreciate the content. I think the play performance is really fun. The fact that we get it as a separate play handout, we get all these maps. So the actual content included here is great. I think there's a song included here as well. Yeah, here we go. The actual Song of Love that's performed, actual like music sheet music, is really cool. So I like all the extra features and things. So that's a really cool add. And then all the extra stat blocks. As I said, we get knights, berserkers, spies, archers. If you like goblins, I guess this is the adventure for you. All right, let's go over my pros and cons for Scourge of the Nightingale Part 1, A Song of Love. Pros, the bridge tree encounter makes for an interesting dynamic combat encounter. I like the different elevations. I think that's a really fun way of creating a kind of natural hazard and just interesting to think tactically about how to move around and get to all these different goblins that can be shooting at you. Pros, there are multiple options for infiltrating the fort and completing the adventure, which goes into my other pro, that one of those options is to perform a play, which is actually written, and you've got little handouts you can give to the players, which is a really neat idea. Pro, DM and player maps and handouts. Always a huge plus when I get my maps. Thank you so much. My only con really is the level scaling is just too extreme here. Scaling with levels 1 to 10 means potentially dealing with like hilariously overpowered goblins, which I don't know. I don't know why I have such a problem with it, but I don't like the thought of a goblin berserker with, you know what, let's just look at it real quick. I'm going to go on a slight rant here with a goblin berserker, which I think literally has like the berserker stat block. AC of 14, 67 hit points, still has nimble escape, and a giant great axe. So it's a really weird cross between a standard berserker, but like in goblin form. So I don't know. I find it weird to deal with goblins at this high of level. I feel like you should just upgrade things to hobgoblins at that point, make them a little bit more militaristic anyway, because they'd be the ones manning a fort. Or just scale this to be just purely tier 1, because it feels like thematically, with rescuing somebody from goblin, like that is very much low-level things to do. So I'm not a huge fan of the extreme way this is level scaled. I think just concentrating on a smaller range would have been more effective. Final verdict, although part one of the larger Nightingale trilogy, A Song of Love tells a complete mini-adventure with fun encounters and a delightfully written play. Thank you to everyone for watching this video review. You can see my written review at roguewatson.com. You can support my work at patreon.com/roguewatson, and you can follow our own D&D adventures here on my YouTube channel. Thank you.